Welcome back, everybody, to the second half. I was reminded in the interval that there's an FA football final on this afternoon, so I think we've got the best players in our team. We have a number of questions in the chat, so I'll kick off. We had an extremely stimulating first half. I certainly took a lot from it in terms of we understand that we have to disrupt and change the food system, but the ways in which we do it is on several different levels that are interconnected. And I think every speaker in one way or in another showed how not only was it possible, we have already started, if you like, with chipping away at the fossil and starting to create a new system. It's how do we scale up at the level that is needed with a sense of urgency now. I'll start with a question which is addressed to the whole panel. Could the speakers could they elaborate on the economic arguments that can support active food policy? Christina, if I could come to you first.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the cost of obesity to society and even to workforce capacity now is huge. You know, the estimate of 94 billion a year means that we need to act. And I think, therefore, having a stronger action on what we know is the core determinants of poor diet is fundamental. And there's kind of no excuses for it anymore. There's an excellent report that's been done by Dolly Tulkin and Henry Dimbleby, where they interviewed about 30 to 40 ex-secretary of states, prime ministers, chancellors, and what they all said is that they wish that they'd done more on poor diet when they were in reign. Now that's easy to say, but it feels like there's a real gravitas at the moment, and society talking about it and the economic argument is fundamental. Do you know, to see the statistics around children being 5 years old and that their height is smaller than it was 5 years ago, that's terrible. That tells you the state of children's diets. You know, that tooth decay is rife among young children because of our food supply. It tells you that we really do need strong action. And I think one of the worries for me is the obesity drugs is that they are appealing because they seem to be a quick fix, but that will also cost society a huge amount of money, and that quick fix isn't long lasting. And in the end, the power imbalances are actually going to be exacerbated because you've got big pharmaceutical companies and big food companies who, you know, will both end up benefiting. So plus the actual reality that those drugs won't work unless we return people and support people with a healthy food environment. So I think those core strong actions, and what's realistic at the moment for me, is to take a strong regulatory approach on HFSS. It's already being used as a definition of unhealthy foods. Let's go with that so that there's a level playing field. Things are well and actively enforced. And then we fundamentally put investment into horticulture around fruit and vegetables and, you know, beans and pulses.
Thank you. That strong point from you about enforcement is absolutely essential, isn't it, as a leader of a local authority, because we can't enforce. Our hands are really tied behind our backs in some ways. I'd like to bring in Kevin.
Good morning, Marianne.
Morning, Kevin.
Can you hear me okay?
We can, yeah.
Yeah. Well, in answer to your question, Marianne, all I would do is to add to what Christina has just said by saying what I don't believe the political class has fully woken up to is that food can deliver multiple benefits. We tend to think of it in terms of consumption, you know, the diet-related problems associated with mainstream food, for example. But if we address those problems properly, we can use that power of purchase, as I've been talking about. Procurement power is an untapped power to not just address health-related problems that Christina has been talking about, but we can use that power, if it's deployed properly, to really regenerate a horticultural, a food system that can supply healthier, more sustainable food. So we get triple dividends. It's healthier, it's more resilient, it's more sustainable, and it creates business opportunities for domestic producers. And this has been the problem with the food system, food policies that we've operated for 30, 40 years. We've gone global, as it were, to try to abolish the concept of seasonality, thinking that's modern and smart. And the unintended consequences is where we are today, having an agri-food polycrisis, as I call it. So in answer to the question, the short answer is we should recognize food for having multiple benefits, and we need to join up policies, whether it's for consumption, procurement, or production, and using food as the catalyst.
Powerful stuff, Kevin, as usual. Debbie,
I think we might well be on the way, because I'd like to ask the government what they're going to do with the 25 billion that they're raising through the increase in national insurance. And I actually think most people, political classes, as you've used a term on this call, know what healthy food is and what healthy food isn't. But it would be great if some of that was actually going into grassroots education. When I was at school, we did domestic science. That was really teaching you how to cook and how to look after yourself. We have generations that have completely missed that. So I think there are systemic changes, and a good place to start was how much of the 25 billion that's being raised through national insurance is going to go into improving the quality and production of the food that we consume here in the UK. But I would also say there's so much that those things take a long time. I remember campaigning for the removal of VAT on sanitary protection, and 25 years later, we're almost there, but not fully. So, these things it'll take a generation to change. So always trying to find the simple, practical things. And sadly, I go back to poverty, and often the poorest are the least educated and are the ones that are consuming the most unhealthy food as well. So it requires a joined up approach, but let's not miss the opportunity. Where is the increase in national insurance contributions going, and can we grab some of that for this purpose?
Indeed. I think we have a tension, don't we, between what is urgently needed now and recognising there are generational changes. Where we have seen governments like Finland, for example, back in the 80s and 90s, who tackled the obesity crisis, it was root and branch very early on. It took a generation to see the improvements, but they were substantial, and they took some very radical decisions, which I can see our Welsh government at the moment is up for it through the universal free school meals. But can we make that compulsory rather than opt in?
Yeah, and I think just sort of building on that, I go back to milk and the removal of free school milk. You can actually almost track obesity in particularly in infant and primary education with the removal of milk.
Indeed, I remember Thatcher, the milk Thatcher. I'm old enough. We have a really interesting question here on loneliness and the extent to which we know or don't know the connection between mental health and good diet. And I'd bring you in here, Kevin. Do you have anything that you could add to this conversation?
Well, I'm very pleased you asked that question, Marianne, or somebody has asked that question, because if we begin with the challenge of loneliness, it helps us to understand the things that Christina and Debbie have been talking about as well. how we need to join things up and see that everything connects here. If we don't protect a Meals on Wheels service, and I take my hats off to you in Monmouthshire, Marianne, because Monmouthshire has done its best to try to retain that service. So many councils are dropping it, but Monmouthshire at least begins to frame the problem properly by recognising that a Meals on Wheels service, apart from providing nourishment to people wanting it to try to lead an independent life, the people who deliver a Meals on Wheels service, as you and I have discussed in the past, also help to address the problem of social isolation and loneliness. And those people keep senior citizens connected. And if that service isn't properly framed properly to see the multiple benefits, as I say, that comes from a Meals on Wheels service, and that the costs and benefits of that service are properly calculated, are properly factored in to the way in which the public sector thinks about cost and how we need to shift investment from treatment to prevention. Unless we can do that, we can never really address our legislation in Wales for the well-being of future generations. And I'm delighted to say that the Commissioner, Derek Walker, fully gets this and is trying to address it himself. So once again, Marianne, food is a way to help us to illustrate these multiple interconnections between loneliness, well-being, isolation, and having nourishment, so that people can live dignified lives as they grow older.
I think it's true. The Monmouthshire model of domiciliary meals is something that we're always looking to improve and looking at ways in which we can work with other providers. I believe we're now the only local authority in Wales who keeps that. However, I think there are opportunities here for cooperatives and thinking through how you can work in partnership and to deliver those kind of meals and to bring. I'll give you an example from the way in which we run Meals on Wheels, as you put it. The kind of routes we do allows for somebody delivering meals to spend more time or less time depending on the need of the person that they're delivering to. And in some cases, we've had a person delivering meals in a particular area bringing 2 or 3 people together so they can eat their meal together with the person bringing the meal, who helps them heat it and so forth. That can be done by cooperative providers. I can see you dying to come in there.
I am dying to come in. I just wanted to add that I think that this works across the life course. So older adults are particularly important, you know, it's a growing population, and absolutely I support everything that yourself and Kevin have just said, but I do think that this works across the life course. We're talking about schools, we're talking about nurseries, we're talking about our high streets, and there's a big push from Nourish Scotland and others around social diners and the important role that they may play. We know that adolescents love that socialization and that often that they congregate in fast food outlets because they seem to be desirable, they're comfortable, they're standardized, you know, they are profiled. But why are we not really advocating for freshly cooked foods in really social environments where we bring back that community kind of spirit, we bring back that connectiveness to local producers, to our chefs and our professional cooks, and really celebrating that. And I think that would and could be a benefit across the life course. We know from some of the excellent work that chefs in schools are doing that when you have freshly cooked food that is delicious and healthy and you're connected and you've been part of designing that menu, it's not only the students that want to eat that all together, but actually the staff want to eat it as well when it tastes that good and it's that delicious. And that's even better for mental well-being and health. It's not something for adults and something for children. It brings us all together. Food is fundamental in socialization and well-being in the way that you raised. And I agree with Kevin that I don't think that we're celebrating that as much as we could.
That's a good point to bring in a question from Sarah Birch, which is quite a long one. So if Sarah's still online, I'll bring her in to ask the question.
Thanks, Marianne, and I'll probably Tracy. I think a lot of the pub, and this is for the panel as a whole, really, a lot of the public narrative around healthy food comes across to a lot of the public as a bit of a lecture with a bit of strong class element, risks further stigmatizing people with living with obesity. And should we instead be talking about a right to healthy food, a right to be able to afford it, a right to have time to cook it, in terms of policy around benefits and tax and work, prioritizing family life? We know that lots of people are not just money poor, they are also time poor.
I'll bring in Debbie first.
Thanks. Actually, I think both questions are quite linked, class, loneliness, all of those things. And of course, certainly loneliness reaches everybody at different stages. There are many single parents that feel incredibly lonely and isolated. Of course, there's an irony. There's probably an older person down the street that's got all the skills. And it sort of harks back for me to Daniel Blake, which then film that everybody should see. Certainly, every policy maker should see for sure, which then links in the sort of class element of it all, because we're all limited by what we know, and of course what we don't know too. So I do think multi-generational, where you're sharing your skills and you're bringing value, is really, really important. But as we know, sadly, the most isolated are the most difficult to reach. And that's why sort of looking after our retired colleagues is actually really important to us. It was actually started by Emmanuel Merchant, a former chief exec, and is supported massively by our president, Elaine Dean. And I think all organisations, whether it's educational or work settings, can think about this. What happens when somebody leaves your organisation? They've got this wealth of knowledge and experience, but they feel redundant. They feel marginalised and taken out of society, yet they have so much to offer. And I think there is a lot to be said for how we can link the groups together, where one of them has got the skill, the other's got the energy, and together they can break bread and they can make extraordinary meals for themselves at a very local level. And who knows where that could sort of grow and develop as they introduce more people. There's probably just another comment. My mum was a home help. It's completely stopped in England. I don't know whether it still exists in Wales. But that, of course, goes beyond the Meals on Wheels, because it is about time, it is about care, it is about the oversight, it is about combating loneliness. And I wonder whether there is a cooperative model that could be developed that brings all of those things together. But it is really about the word dignity has been used, and I think that is so important, about the respect that we give to people. We've all got something to give. Sadly, so many people forget the skills and the benefits that they can bring to others. But I think the power of cooperation could really start to harness and bring together some of those things. But pay is fundamental, and for me, making work pay, and a broken benefit system that isn't helping people get back into work, and the dignity and the independence that provides.
You're so right, Debbie, on that one. Christina or Kevin, do you want to add anything?
I'm happy to go in, Kevin, if that's okay, and then you could come next. I'm sorry, Kevin, I can't see you on the screen. Sarah, such a fundamental question. Inequalities are increasing, and we know that it's not from want of will from families. I'm leading the national evaluation of the Healthy Start scheme, which provides a financial support to families on very low incomes with young children, and they are doing everything they can. And this is families across the board. But the cost inequalities make it so hard that, many families are trying to have, to bring up children working, and the lower income jobs are often less flexible in their working hours, so you can't be around to cook a meal, like all these really practical components. So government policy for the last 30 years has been focused on individual behaviour change. That's not the answer on its own by any means. People know what to do. What is the answer is changing the environments in which we're living in. And local authorities are doing a lot within their powers to be able to do that. They're trying to rebalance the numbers of fast food outlets and convenience stores against, fresh grocery stores. But they're also now banning advertising, but that's within a structure of the national government, and both are needed to work together. So again, I would come down back to my key points is we need strong action to rebalance the power, and that is through regulation, strong enforcement, and then also boosting this minimally processed food. The last thing I just wanted to point out was about skills development. And I think skills development is fundamental that we're not talking about as much. So to fix the welfare state in the way that Debbie just described, we want to be putting money and effort into skills development. And there are skills across the food sector that are not being trained or seen as desirable for young people, but even for people that have been out of work for a while. So there's much that we could do. Cooks nourish us. They nourish us as consumers. They nourish farmers because they're using natural ingredients. It's that middle supply chain where there's so much power, yet actually we need to disrupt that a bit more. And I think that it's about being strategic in terms of the policies and bundling policies in a way that they're most likely to be effective in the shortest space of time. But they do need cross-party agreement so that they can move forward. So I think my call would be for individuals to be saying, I'm trying my best, and writing to our MPs and saying, but the food environment makes this so hard, and it's not just my fault. And I think we really need to talk about that narrative of changing food environments much, much more, because individuals are and families are trying their hardest in really tough environments. And then the last thing to say is, again, I think the obesity drugs run the risk of exacerbating that. Again, it individualizes the problem because the individual effect size is so large, it's seen as being desirable. But we neglect that if we have population level policies that are effective, they're going to impact many, many more people and all generations. And that is so important.
Thanks, Christina. I'll bring you in briefly because we have quite a lot of questions coming thick and fast now, Kevin. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, the only thing to add is to go back to Sarah's original question, which I thought was an excellent question about the right to food. Of course, the right to food is an important political device to raise awareness, but we just need to remember, the right to food was recognised in 1948 as part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The question isn't really, should we recognise a right to food? It's been recognised for many years. The point is, what do we do about that right, and how do we implement it? And that goes back to the biggest problem of all in the food system, it seems to me, and that is the gap, the huge gap between the evidence base and the political will to implement the evidence base. The jury is in, and we need to act on it.
I wonder, Kevin, just on all of that, whether there's a way of having food credits. So, at the moment, because if a proportion of benefits that were paid in food credits that actually recognise what the real cost of food, healthy food, was for a family, so that would almost preserve it, whether it was just, the credits could only be used in certain outlets, for example, which, you would say would be mainstream grocery stores that are selling fresh fruit, vegetables, high quality protein, etc. That might be something that would protect and almost therefore give the access, because I think you're right, everybody agrees, of course, you've got the right to food, but how do you make it a reality?
Which brings us on to a health question here. If we do nothing about ultra-processed food in the NHS could go bankrupt for the various reasons that have been outlined here. So what steps do we need to be taken to make the food producers contribute to the cost of of all the ill health they're creating. And I would add to start pooling for good health and good diet. I'll bring you in first, Kevin.
Yeah, it's a great question, Marianne, and I think it goes back to thinking about the real costs and benefits of food and its impact on health, on environment, and the costs of inequality. And all I would say is when people say something is too expensive to do, that's because they've ignored the fundamental question is what are the costs of inaction? What are the costs of the status quo? And those costs are enormous. And therefore, we need to address the costs of the status quo to get us to a healthier, fairer, more sustainable food system. And I think we've already heard the evidence from Christina, from Debbie, and others about what we need to do. As I said earlier, the question isn't about the evidence, Marianne. It's about the political will to act on it.
Debbie, do you want to add anything here?
Yeah, it's just so complex because, of course, there is a VAT system. So arguably, the government is already collecting. But I think, and there's probably better qualified people on this call, but the obesity costs more to the NHS than alcohol and tobacco put together. Now, both those sectors are massively taxed. So absolutely. Huge proportions of the price of a bottle of wine, a can of beer, or a packet of cigarettes goes back into the government coffers. So whilst there is VAT, which should present a difference, it's just not big enough. And I think confronted with the reality of the cost per calorie of healthy food versus the cost per calorie of unhealthy food, too many people are forced to make the wrong decision. And it comes back to just not having the means to be able to make the healthier choices. So it would take significant intervention to increase the levies, through the high fat, salt, sugar proposals, etc. But they just take so long to get these things these things through. So I think it has to be a combination of long-term systemic change and policy, but it has to be coupled with the here and now and the things that we can practically do to help people who are so desperate and so want to make the improvements for themselves and for their families.
Indeed. Debbie, I've got a question, but really a challenge directly to you, which is, would central cooperatives consider putting a motion to the Co-op Congress to take more direct action on ultra-processed food, a bit like the way the fair trade movement was kick-started by many cooperatives?
Yeah, of course we would.
There you go. Take it away, Debbie.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's
We
heartbreaking.
are all behind you on this.
Yeah. Do you know, it's utterly heartbreaking. I think back to being in school and there may be one child that was struggling with their weight in a class. My granddaughter's 4, I would say coming up to half, if not more, are an unhealthy weight for that. It's heartbreaking.
It is. I was talking to our school catering manager yesterday, looking at the fact that take up in schools where there's a higher level of pupils who are eligible for free school meals, that is, that they are economically disadvantaged, is much lower than in schools where the number of pupils who are eligible for free school meals is low. And we were talking through issues about pupils feeling hungry and people eating everything on their plate, the culture that they have where they live as well as in their homes. And we are now at a position where it hovers around 75% of our pupils have a free school meal every day that's cooked from scratch. And I can tell you it's tasty. I've bought the the then cabinet secretary for education to eat the meal with us.
Yeah. But I mean, even
But
that
to
you're
get that
eligible.
75 to 100% is really, really difficult because it's a system change, not a behaviour change on its
Absolutely.
own. And one of the things she said to me, which hadn't occurred to me, is that children who are not used to eating a range of vegetables, which is part of what we do, eat the sausages on the plate, for example, eat the fish fingers on the plate, might eat the potato wedges, we don't do chips, but they'll ignore the broccoli and the sweet corn, or they'll ignore the broccoli and the salad bar. And one of the things that we're trying out is called Tasty Tuesdays, bringing in parents, carers and grandparents to eat the meal, but also to cook a meal from scratch. And she went back to talk to the learners about the changes that have made, and she noticed that one learner was eating broccoli, and she said, "Oh, are you enjoying that?" And he said, "Duh, of course I enjoy broccoli, it's great," which wasn't what was being saying 2 years ago. Because we're dedicated to it in Monmouthshire, we know it's a long haul. There isn't enough discussion about, once you've picked the low-hanging fruits, how do you get to that marginal area, that 15%, so that everybody is having access to nutritional food, and it's part of what they do in life, and the families are part of that journey, the people that care for them.
It's wonderful what you're doing. It really is. And I think there's a statistic that if a child it has to be introduced to certain foods 10 times before they'll actually start to accept it, with the exception of sugar, which they accept at their first taste. So we're not just up against policy, government, we're up against actually the human preferences.
Indeed.
May I come in there, Marianne, and add two things? I mean, I agree. I think what you're doing sounds incredible. I think two things that I would say is that from our Healthy Start evaluation, it's not dissimilar. You know, the rates of uptake are around, well, we don't actually know because the data is not available, but it's around 65 to 75%, I think. And it's an increase from digitalization of the scheme. But there is still a large proportion, 25 to, potentially 40% of families that are not accessing this, that are eligible. And our research has really shown that it's often the additional outreach and the more bespoke communication in the way that you're describing that is necessary. So having people that families can relate to, conveying this message and explaining the benefits is actually really very essential. So that additional outreach support, which is sort of what we've known from population interventions, is that a general intervention will work for many and for most, but often for the most vulnerable, or we need to do that little bit extra. So I think it's when we're thinking about implementing interventions, how do we always make sure that we've got extra funding and resource to provide that additional bespoke energy and effort. The other thing I would say, I think specifically around vegetables and beans and pulses, they're not characterized as desirable in any sort of children's programs, in any marketing or advertising. And we know from Eat Them to Defeat Them, the amazing social marketing campaign from Veg Power, that it can be effective, but it's short-lived because it's one tiny little campaign amongst a plethora of marketing of unhealthy foods and promotions and celebrities celebrating unhealthy foods. So I think the other part of me for that is, how do we get an injection of funding for a sustained marketing campaign around making vegetables and beans and pulses attractive to at a social level, and how do we start to change that culture? And I think that really is important. And potentially, through the horticultural strategy, how do we not just support the growth and development of those vegetables, but actually give a bit of a marketing budget so that these young companies, SMEs, can also really widely promote their produce. So I think it's double-edged there.
I wonder how much. Sorry to interrupt. I'm just wondering. How much of school could schools do to, because children love growing things, you know, they which is life itself. And I just wonder, you know, how much of the sort of school grounds could a veg patch be created, just to, you know, to get to feel the soil. And I'm sure these things are done already. Certainly, you're very progressive in your thinking, but it's absolutely staggered us how many people that just shop at their local co-op are saying, yeah, we want to do this. You know, that they're having the first harvest of rhubarb over the last few weeks, and you know, it's like, come and get it. There's so much of it, and and so suddenly the children that were planting it or want to turn it into a pie and want to do something with it, because there is the joy of food, of real food that you plant, that you watch grow.
I think that's right, and I think Wales, along with Scotland, are really promoting community growing, but not just community growing in schools.
Yeah.
We've just opened the first net zero carbon 3 to 19 school in Wales, and that has provision for classroom growing for every year, but also a kitchen. So from the growing to the kitchen to eating is there as part of the school. It's also integrated into our school curriculums, but that is true in other local authorities across Wales. And I think you'll all agree with me, colleagues, that the fact we don't have academies, the fact that we are our schools are under local authorities and devolved to Wales, and we have a different curriculum which allows us to look at this, is a really important part of our toolkit here in Wales.
Brilliant.
Mr. Riley, I'd like to bring you in because you're being very active on the chat, and patiently waiting for your question on Welsh lamb. Is most often grazed on land sprayed with Grazon Pro, while New Zealand blood products are deemed pure. They're the only ones that can be used in medical research. So what is being done to forward the disuse of poisons in the farming industry?
Like Christine, doesn't it?
Does anyone want to bring that one, to take that one up?
Go on, Christine.
I can touch on it briefly. It's not my area of expertise. I have colleagues working on a lot of agricultural projects, but there's a lot being done. You know, there is a big push for nature-based solutions, for more sustainable farming practices. Farmers are obviously under a huge amount of pressure at the moment. You know, many farmers are just making very small margins, and a lot of is being expected of them. They're having to adapt to climate change, in addition to, you know, previous, you know, known climatic changes. So farming, I think, is under a lot of pressure. I think there is a lot of work being done. I think this will form part, well, hope that it will form part of the food strategy that is being developed, and the nutrients that come from soil, the health of the soil is very much around recognized and increasingly recognized as very, very important. And yeah, I think that's probably all I would say, is it's really recognized that this is an important issue. It is not only about the impact on human health, but also the ability to grow viable crops and really good efficient crops. And so I think there is a recognition of the need for change. I would say that, like all systems change, it's harder, and some farmers are ahead of the curve than others. But I think it is definitely being widely discussed.
Thanks, Christine. I think we've got time for one last question, and I'm noticing that there are many questions about how we are dealing with food insecurity that is deepening because of inequalities, and a response to the cost of living crisis. We know that food banks are intolerable, inappropriate, and appear to be putting it down to individual and community effort rather than dealing with food systems. But we also have food cafes, food banks, food pantries, community growing schemes, where cooperatives, communities, individuals are really trying hard on an individual basis to both feel food secure, but also to change patterns and behaviours. So looking at positive way forwards, I'm going to ask each of the panel members in turn, what are the jewels that you've seen of projects or people or partnerships that are both trying to change and disrupt the system, but at the same time deal with the current crisis? I'll start with you, Kevin.
Thanks, Marianne. Well, I've recently written a book about this, where I've tried to identify organisations, local authorities, health trusts, civil society organisations around the world that are serving good food against the odds. They're doing it despite the system rather than because of the system. And I identify that the main challenge for us is to how do we spread that good practice? These social innovators are proving that good food can be delivered. The question is, why aren't more organizations following suit? How, in other words, do we identify good practice and make sure that it becomes the norm and not the exception? And that's the big challenge for me in food policy.
Debbie.
You know, the language that we use, it's so challenging. You know, we talk about inequalities. What we really mean is people not having, poor people not having enough money to buy food. And, you know, ultimately the bottom line for me is that we have just got to raise the standards to make work pay. And there have been real moves in terms of obviously the introduction of a minimum wage and now a living wage, etc. We've seen increases in the threshold before you pay taxation, but it's still inadequate, and that for me is the fundamental problem. If we are to give people dignity. So I just don't want us to shy away. We're still trying to find solutions rather than look at actually what is the root cause. You know, we are an incredibly wealthy country, but we actually the media this morning is all about how many billionaires we've lost over the last 12 months. Actually, you know, we should be looking at it in a completely different way. How many people are living in poverty? And that is, for me, is fundamentally the issue that needs to be raised, because I don't think any of us like to see it. You know, the homelessness. I'm here in Manchester for the co-op group annual members meeting, you know, and you just walk through and your heart bleeds. Ex-service people that have nowhere to go, nowhere to turn. It's absolutely shocking. So I don't think we should shy away from, there's a fundamental problem that needs resolving. And when then it comes to what are the really good things that happen, so on a real positive side, there is an app which is called Kandoroo, and Tanya Noon, who a former board member in our society and a colleague in our society, has been working with. So what Kandoroo does is give dignity to people that are unfortunately dependent on food banks for their food. So it means instead of us donating to food banks, you can donate to Kandoroo. And then the people that used to go to the food banks and then be told, oh, here's the canned potatoes. And I always ask, when was the last time you bought a can of potatoes? So even the inequalities means that we're actually putting food into food banks because we think that's what the people that need a food bank want, not even the things that we buy for ourselves. So they can go into our stores and spend the credit on their Kandoroo app. So it's making it less visible, but I think it's a brilliant way of giving dignity. So it means you could donate on a direct debit basis if you were in a position to be able to do so, rather than putting canned and packet goods in a food bin in your store, and therefore giving dignity to the individual so they can make the food choices that they want with the credits that they've been given. So Kandoroo, great idea.
Debbie, I'd definitely personally like to hear more about that. If you could pop it in the chat, but also David, could we ensure that when we circulate the video from this, that we also circulate some of the ideas that are coming up and reminders of the links to various things that were put in the chat? So
I can't put that in. I'm sorry, just because I'm on a device. I just don't know how to put it in
Don't
the
worry,
chat. I
Debbie.
can't even see it either. So,
don't worry, Debbie. If you tell David afterwards, we'll make sure it's circulated.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Christina, the last word is with you.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. I think what Debbie and Kevin's contributions are both, absolutely spot on, and what people are doing on the ground is remarkable. They are filling a policy gap. And so for me, then the question, if I'm Professor of Food Policy, what are the policy solutions? I think it is about greater equity across the supply chains, greater transparency, and requiring greater transparency, particularly of big businesses, of what they are actually doing in their current practices. And then I think that would allow greater engagement. But the final and the most important policy levers are about the nutritional safety nets that we already have, and how do we make them more fit for purpose. So in England, really calling for universal free school meals, increasing that threshold, ensuring that Healthy Start is, again, the eligibility thresholds keep up with existing inflation and benefit increase, because those thresholds haven't changed, aligning them, Healthy Start and free school meals, so that there's not a gap for families that make them more vulnerable to needing to rely on local support. And in addition to that, bringing in social prescribing programs for adults, where actually they're given support, make connections through community groups, but also are given some financial support for healthier food. So I think there's a range of different specific policies that we could call for that, again, would work across the life course.
Thank you. And that was perfectly on time. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for giving up part of your Saturday morning, which is an ongoing conversation, which, as always, needs to be linked to our campaigning, our advocacy, our lobbying, and that wherever we are, whatever we do, whether we're an academic, whether we're working in local councils, whether we're in a cooperative, we know that we have to keep pushing this agenda. It is urgent. Our food system is in a crisis. We cannot afford to stay silent, and we cannot afford not to make changes in law, in policy, in what we do in practice. That is just as important as asking people to change their behaviours. Far more important, in my view. That's where we start. I'd like to thank our speakers, who have been really thought-provoking, very engaging. I've learned a lot. So thank you, Debbie, Kevin and Christina. And also I'd like to thank Chris for facilitating the first part of this session so very well. And lastly, for all of you who've remained till the end, thank you. And have a good rest of the day. Make sure you eat healthy.
Thank you to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.